Some men are shaped by loneliness, carved hollow by years of silence until they forget what their own voice sounds like. Ezra Blackwood knew this truth better than most, having spent 15 winters alone in the Colorado mountains with only the wind for company. His weathered cabin sat like a forgotten prayer among the pines, where he trapped fur and mined silver in blessed solitude. When the mail rider brought news of an inheritance from his deceased uncle in Denver, Ezra expected maybe some tools or a deed to worthless land. He'd never expected to inherit 2 mail-order brides, refined ladies from back east with silk dresses and city ways, completely unprepared for frontier life. But what happens when a man who's forgotten how to love suddenly finds himself responsible for 2 women who've never known hardship? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence had become Ezra Blackwood's closest companion. It lived in every corner of his handmade cabin, settled into the chinks between the logs he'd cut and fitted himself 15 years ago. The morning light filtered through windows he'd glazed with his own careful hands, casting familiar shadows across floorboards worn smooth by his solitary footsteps. At 42, Ezra moved through his daily rituals with the precision of a man who had learned that survival depended on routine. His calloused fingers wrapped around the handle of the coffee pot, a dented tin thing that had served him faithfully through a decade and a half of mountain winters. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, black as the coal seams that veined the mountainside, and he drank it standing at the window that faced east toward the valley. Beyond the glass, the Colorado Territory stretched in all directions, an endless tapestry of pine and granite, snow-capped peaks that caught the dawn light like distant prayers. This had been his world since the winter of 1867. When an avalanche had claimed his younger brother Samuel and left Ezra with nothing but grief and a determination to never again depend on another human soul. Samuel had been the dreamer, the one with plans for their shared mining claim, the one who could make Ezra laugh until his sides ached. Now Samuel's bones lay somewhere beneath tons of stone and ice, and Ezra lived each day in the shadow of that loss. The cabin itself stood as testament to Ezra's skill with his hands. Every timber had been felled by his axe, every joint fitted with painstaking care. The stone fireplace drew smoke cleanly up the chimney he'd built stone by stone, and the thick walls kept the mountain cold at bay even when the wind howled like a wounded animal. It was a good cabin, solid and true, but it had been built for solitude. One room served as kitchen, parlor, and sleeping quarters. A smaller back room held his mining equipment, traps, and the pelts he'd collected over the seasons. His daily routine never varied. Before dawn, he'd stoke the fire and put coffee on to boil. While it heated, he'd check the weather and plan his day's work. In winter, that meant tending his trap lines, following familiar paths through snow that often came up to his waist. In summer, he worked his silver claim, a narrow vein that ran along the creek bed 2 miles up the mountain. The work was hard and solitary, but it suited him. Silver didn't betray you. Silver didn't die in avalanches. The mining had been profitable enough over the years. Not rich man profitable, but sufficient for a man with simple needs. Twice a year, he'd load his mule with ore samples and ride down to the trading post at Bear Creek, where he'd sell his silver and buy supplies. Salt, coffee, flour, ammunition, and little else. The trading post owner, a grizzled man named Murphy, would try to engage him in conversation, but Ezra had grown uncomfortable with human speech. His voice, when he used it, sounded rusty and strange to his own ears. The isolation had marked him in ways that went deeper than the lines the sun and wind had etched into his face. His beard had grown wild and full, streaked with premature grey that spoke of hard winters and harder losses. His shoulders had broadened from years of swinging an axe and hauling heavy loads, but his eyes had grown distant, as if he were always looking towards some far horizon that no one else could see. He'd forgotten how to smile naturally, forgotten the easy rhythm of conversation. forgotten what it felt like to care whether another person lived or died. Yet on quiet evenings, when the wind died down and the fire crackled in the hearth, memories would surface unbidden. Samuel's laughter echoing off the cabin walls. His mother's apple pie cooling on the windowsill of their childhood home in Missouri. The warmth of human connection that had once seemed as natural as breathing. Those memories came like ghosts now, insubstantial and painful, reminders of a man he used to be. His uncle Theodore had been the only link to that former life. Theodore Blackwood had built himself a modest fortune in Denver, starting with a single dry goods store and expanding into mining investments and real estate. Every few years, he'd make the arduous journey up into the mountains to check on his hermit nephew, bringing news of the outside world and gentle suggestions that perhaps Ezra might consider coming back to civilization. "You're wasting yourself up here." "Boy," Theodore would say, settling his considerable bulk into the cabin's single chair. "A man needs more than rock and snow to make a life worth living." But Ezra had always shaken his head. The mountains were honest. They didn't make promises they couldn't keep. They didn't die when you needed them most. Theodore would sigh and change the subject, talking instead about the growth of Denver, the coming of the railroad, the opportunities that waited for a capable man willing to take them. The last time Theodore had visited was 3 years ago. In the summer of 1879, he'd seemed older then, his breathing labored from the climb, his face gray with exhaustion. He'd spent 2 days resting at the cabin, talking more than usual about family, about legacy, about the importance of not letting the Blackwood name die out in the wilderness. "I've been thinking about getting married," Theodore had said on his final evening, staring into the fire. "Man my age, it's probably foolish, but I find myself wanting someone to share the years I have left." Ezra had grunted non-committally, uncomfortable with such personal talk. Theodore had pressed on anyway. "There are agencies now in the big cities. They arrange marriages for men like me, men with means, but no time for courtship. Mail-order brides, they call them. Seems practical enough." That had been their last conversation on the subject. Theodore had left the next morning, promising to visit again soon. The promise had been left unfulfilled. Word of his death had reached Ezra through Murphy at the trading post, a heart attack, sudden and final, in his Denver office on a busy Tuesday afternoon. Now, standing in his cabin, with the morning sun slanting through the windows, Ezra held Theodore's final letter in his weathered hands. The envelope bore the letterhead of a Denver law firm, and inside was news that would shatter his carefully constructed solitude like a gunshot through glass. The letter itself was formal, written in the precise hand of a legal clerk. It informed Ezra that he was the sole beneficiary of Theodore Blackwood's estate, inheriting not only his uncle's considerable wealth, but also what the lawyer termed certain personal arrangements that were finalized before Mr. Blackwood's untimely passing. Enclosed with the legal document were 2 smaller envelopes, each bearing a woman's name written in Theodore's familiar scrawl. The first was addressed to Miss Margaret Sullivan of Boston, Massachusetts. The second to Miss Catherine O'Malley of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Inside each envelope, Ezra found a marriage contract, legally binding and properly witnessed, along with a small photographic portrait and a brief letter of introduction. Margaret Sullivan gazed out from her photograph with intelligent, dark eyes and an expression of quiet dignity. Her letter described her as 26 years old, educated at a women's college, and seeking a stable marriage with a man of good character. She was an orphan, raised by maiden aunts who had recently passed away, leaving her alone in the world with little money and fewer prospects. Catherine O'Malley's photograph showed a younger woman, perhaps 23, with auburn hair and a direct gaze that seemed to challenge the camera itself. Her letter was shorter and less formal, mentioning only that she sought a fresh start in the Western Territories and possessed skills in household management and outdoor pursuits uncommon to ladies of gentle breeding. The marriage contracts were identical in their legal language but stunning in their implications. Theodore had arranged for both women to travel west at his expense, with the understanding that they would marry his heir, a man they assumed to be Theodore himself. The contracts guaranteed financial security, a home in Colorado Territory, and the protection of the Blackwood name. In return, each woman agreed to fulfill the duties of a frontier wife and helpmate. But Theodore was dead, and his heir was not the refined Denver businessman these women expected. His heir was a bearded mountain hermit who had spoken to perhaps a dozen people in the past 5 years, who slept alone in a one-room cabin and hadn't worn anything but work clothes and buckskins since the Cleveland administration. The legal implications were clear enough. As Theodore's heir, Ezra was bound by these contracts. The women were already en route, having left their eastern cities weeks ago based on Theodore's final communications. They would arrive at the Bear Creek trading post within the month, expecting to meet their intended husband and begin their new lives as frontier wives. Ezra set the letters aside and walked to his window, staring out at the wilderness that had been his refuge and his prison. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the air and setting the dewdrops on the pine needles to sparkling like tiny diamonds. A hawk circled high overhead, riding the mountain thermals with lazy grace. The world outside remained unchanged, but inside the cabin everything had shifted. He could refuse, of course. He could write to the lawyers in Denver, explain the situation, and arrange for the women's return east. But Theodore had been the only family he had left, and the old man had clearly put considerable thought and money into these arrangements. To simply abandon these women would be to dishonor his uncle's final wishes. More troubling was the question of which woman he was meant to marry. The contracts were equally binding, equally valid. Had Theodore intended for Ezra to choose? Had this been some elaborate matchmaking scheme, presenting two options in the hope that one would suit? Or had there been some mix-up in the legal arrangements, some error that left both contracts in effect? The silence that had been his companion for 15 years suddenly felt oppressive. The cabin walls seemed to press inward, and for the first time in memory, Ezra found himself longing for human voices, for the complexity and unpredictability of other people's lives. He was about to get more human contact than he'd experienced since Samuel's death, whether he wanted it or not. Outside, a squirrel chattered angrily from the branches of a nearby pine, disturbed by some perceived threat. Ezra envied the creature its simple concerns: food, shelter, safety from predators. Human problems were infinitely more complicated, fraught with emotions and obligations that couldn't be solved with an axe or a rifle. The women would arrive within weeks, carrying their own hopes and fears, their own reasons for traveling thousands of miles to marry a stranger. They would find not the established businessman they expected, but a man who had forgotten how to live among civilized people. The collision of their worlds would change everything, would shatter the careful equilibrium he had built in the mountain silence. Ezra folded the letters carefully and placed them in the wooden box where he kept his few important papers. Then he looked around his cabin with new eyes, seeing it not as the perfect refuge he had created, but as the inadequate shelter it would become when 3 people tried to share its single room. Changes would have to be made. Preparations would have to be undertaken. And somehow he would have to remember how to be human again. The marriage contracts lay spread across Ezra's rough-hewn table like accusations, their formal language a stark contrast to the rustic cabin interior. He had read each document 3 times, hoping to find some loophole, some escape clause that would release him from this impossible situation. But the legal language was ironclad, witnessed and notarized, with Theodore's characteristic attention to detail. Each contract bore identical terms. The bride would travel west at Theodore's expense, marry his designated heir, and receive a generous settlement including housing, financial support, and protection. In return, she would serve as wife and companion, managing household affairs and adapting to frontier life. The contracts had been signed months ago, when Theodore still lived and breathed and made plans for his nephew's future. Margaret Sullivan's photograph showed a woman of obvious refinement. Her dark hair was arranged in the latest fashion, Her dress was silk with delicate lace trim, and her posture spoke of years of deportment lessons. The accompanying letter, written in an educated hand, revealed more of her character. She had lost her parents to consumption while still young and been raised by spinster aunts who valued learning above all else. Margaret could read Latin, spoke passable French, and had studied literature and philosophy at Mount Holyoke College. "I seek not romantic passion," her letter stated with refreshing honesty, "but rather a partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. I understand that frontier life demands practical skills, and I am prepared to learn whatever may be required of me. My aunts have left me with modest means, but few prospects for marriage in Boston society. A life in the Western Territories, while challenging, offers opportunities for a woman of determination." Catherine O'Malley presented a very different picture. Her auburn hair caught the light in her photograph, and her green eyes held a hint of mischief that the formal portrait couldn't quite suppress. Where Margaret's letter was measured and thoughtful, Catherine's was brief and spirited. "I'm called Kit by those who know me well," she wrote in a bold, flowing script. "I can ride, shoot, and cook over an open fire. Skills my dear mother thought unseemly for a lady, but which may serve me well in Colorado. I seek adventure and a fresh beginning, far from the stuffiness of Philadelphia society. I've been told I am headstrong and unconventional, which my former guardian considered a fault, but which I believe to be a virtue in frontier country." The contrast between the two women was striking. Margaret represented Eastern refinement and education, a woman who would bring culture and intellect to the wilderness. Kit embodied spirit and adventure, someone who might actually thrive in the harsh beauty of mountain life. Yet both had signed binding contracts to marry a man they had never met. Based on Theodore's promises of security and a good life, Ezra pushed back from the table and walked to his window, staring out at the familiar landscape that would soon be shared with strangers. The morning sun had climbed higher, and the mountain air carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. Somewhere in that vast distance, two women were making their way toward him, traveling by railroad and stagecoach across a continent, carrying their hopes and possessions toward a future they could barely imagine. The legal implications gnawed at him. Both contracts were valid, both women were en route, both expected to become Mrs. Ezra Blackwood. How had Theodore intended this to work? Had the old man planned for Ezra to choose between them? Or had there been some terrible mix-up in the arrangements? He pulled out Theodore's personal effects, which had been forwarded with the legal documents. Among them was a small leather journal, its pages filled with his uncle's careful handwriting. Ezra had never been one for reading another man's private thoughts. But desperate circumstances called for desperate measures. The journal revealed Theodore's growing obsession with ensuring the Blackwood family line continued. Entry after entry detailed his concerns about Ezra's isolation, his fears that his nephew would die alone in the mountains without ever experiencing love or fatherhood. Theodore had researched the mail-order bride agencies extensively, corresponding with several before settling on arrangements with two different companies. "Miss Sullivan represents stability and education," one entry read. "She would bring refinement to Ezra's rough existence and could educate any children they might have. Miss O'Malley possesses the spirit and practical skills that frontier life demands. Either would make him a suitable wife, but perhaps the choice itself will draw him back into the world of human feeling." The final entries revealed Theodore's true scheme. He had deliberately arranged for both women to arrive at the same time, believing that competition would force Ezra to engage emotionally with at least one of them. Theodore had gambled that the presence of two eligible women would awaken his nephew's dormant capacity for love and companionship. "I know this seems manipulative," Theodore had written in his final entry, "but Ezra has buried himself alive in those mountains. Perhaps the shock of this situation will resurrect the man I remember, the one who could laugh and love before tragedy closed his heart." Ezra closed the journal with trembling hands. His uncle's machinations were both infuriating and heartbreaking. Theodore had loved him enough to orchestrate this elaborate scheme, but he had also condemned two innocent women to travel across the country based on false premises. Neither Margaret nor Kit knew about the other's existence. Each believed she was coming to marry Theodore Blackwood, a prosperous Denver businessman, not his wild hermit nephew. The ethical weight of the situation pressed down on him like a physical burden. He could write to both women, explain the truth, and arrange for their return east. But they had already left their former lives behind, had severed connections, and burned bridges in preparation for new beginnings. Margaret had given up her teaching position. Kit had left her guardian's house under circumstances that her letter hinted were less than amicable. Moreover, the contracts included significant financial penalties for breach. Theodore had structured them carefully to make abandonment costly for all parties. The women had received advance payments that would need to be repaid, and Ezra's inheritance was tied to honoring his uncle's final wishes. Breaking the contracts would leave him wealthy, but would impoverish the very women Theodore had tried to help. A sound from outside broke his dark reverie. Hoofbeats on the mountain trail, moving at a steady pace that suggested a rider familiar with the terrain. Ezra moved to the window and saw Murphy from the trading post approaching on his sturdy bay mare. The man's weathered face was grim, and he carried himself with the urgency of bad news. Murphy dismounted at the cabin's front step and waited for Ezra to emerge. The two men had known each other for years, but had never been friends. Murphy respected Ezra's need for solitude, and Ezra appreciated the trader's discretion about his business. "Got word from Denver?" Murphy said without preamble. "Two ladies arrived at the train station yesterday, asking directions to Theodore Blackwood's place. When they heard he'd passed, they got mighty upset. Seems they were expected." Ezra felt his stomach clench. "They're here already?" "Staying at the Denver House Hotel, last I heard. Mrs. Patterson, who runs the place, sent word up the line. These ladies have traveled a far piece, and they're looking for answers." "Got legal papers and everything?" The trader studied Ezra's face with knowing eyes. "I'm guessing you know something about this situation." Ezra nodded slowly. "Theodore arranged marriages for them." "With his heir," Murphy whistled low. "Both of them. Both of them. Well, that's a pickle and no mistake." Murphy scratched his grizzled chin. "Mrs. Patterson says they're quality women, well-dressed and well-spoken. Not the type to just turn around and head home without getting what they came for." The weight of inevitability settled over Ezra like a heavy blanket. The women were here, they had legal claims, and they deserved better than abandonment in a strange city far from home. Whatever Theodore's motivations, however impossible the situation seemed, Ezra was bound by honor and law to face the consequences of his uncle's scheming. "How long before they reach Bear Creek?" he asked. "If they're determined. Could be here within the week. Stagecoach runs regular now, and they can hire a wagon from there if they need to." Murphy mounted his horse and prepared to leave, then turned back with a final observation. "For what it's worth, Ezra, your uncle always said you were a good man. Maybe he knew something you don't about what you need in life." As the trader disappeared down the mountain trail, Ezra stood alone with the magnitude of his situation. Two women, strangers to each other and to him, were coming to claim their legal right to marriage and a new life. He had perhaps a week to prepare for their arrival, to decide how to handle an impossible situation with honor and compassion. The silence of his mountain refuge had been shattered forever. Soon, very soon, his carefully ordered world would be turned upside down by the presence of people who expected him to be someone he had forgotten how to be. The man who had lived alone for 15 years was about to discover whether isolation had preserved him or destroyed him. Time was running out for solitude, and Ezra Blackwood had no choice but to prepare for the storm that was coming. Margaret Sullivan stood at the window of her hotel room in Denver, watching the bustling street below with a mixture of fascination and growing dread. The silk dress she wore, her finest, saved for meeting her intended husband, felt increasingly inappropriate with each passing hour. The powder blue fabric with its delicate beadwork and intricate bustle had been the height of fashion in Boston, But here, in this rough frontier city, it marked her as clearly as if she wore a sign declaring her ignorance of Western ways. 3 days had passed since she and Catherine O'Malley had discovered the devastating truth about Theodore Blackwood's death. 3 days of confusion, tears, and difficult conversations with lawyers, who seemed more interested in protecting their deceased client's reputation than in helping two stranded women figure out what to do next. The meeting with Catherine had been awkward at first. They had encountered each other in the hotel lobby, two well-dressed women who clearly didn't belong in the rough surroundings, each carrying letters bearing the same Denver law firm's letterhead. Recognition had dawned slowly, followed by embarrassment, and then a strange sort of relief. At least they weren't facing this impossible situation alone. Catherine, Kit, as she insisted on being called, was everything Margaret was not. Where Margaret was reserved and thoughtful, Kit was impulsive and direct. Where Margaret chose her words carefully, Kit spoke her mind without apology. Yet in the 3 days they had spent navigating this crisis together, Margaret had come to appreciate the younger woman's strength and practical nature. "We can't just sit here forever," Kit said from across the room, where she was attempting to mend a torn hem on her traveling dress. Unlike Margaret's elaborate silk gown, Kit's clothing was practical, a simple brown wool dress that could withstand the rigors of travel. "Every day we delay costs us money we don't have, and I refuse to go crawling back to Philadelphia with my tail between my legs." Margaret turned from the window, noting the determined set of Kit's jaw. The auburn-haired woman had been pacing like a caged wildcat for the better part of the morning, and clearly chafing at their forced inactivity. The lawyers said, "This Ezra Blackwood needs time to consider the situation," Margaret said, though she felt as frustrated as Kit looked. "Perhaps he's as shocked by this development as we are." "Shocked or not, we have legal contracts," Kit replied, setting aside her sewing with more force than necessary. "Theodore Blackwood made promises, and his estate is bound to honor them. I didn't come 2,000 miles to be dismissed like some inconvenient package that arrived at the wrong address." Margaret sank into the room's single chair, feeling the weight of their impossible circumstances. In Boston, her life had been constrained but predictable. Teaching at the Young Ladies' Academy, caring for her aging aunts, attending literary society meetings. It had been a narrow existence but a secure one. The decision to answer Theodore's advertisement had taken all her courage. Driven by the knowledge that spinsterhood and poverty awaited her if she remained. "What if this Ezra Blackwood is nothing like his uncle?" she asked quietly. "What if he's some rough mountain man who sees us as unwanted burdens?" Kit stopped pacing and fixed Margaret with a steady gaze. "Then we make the best of it. Neither of us came here with illusions about romance, Margaret. We came for security, for a chance at a different life. Those things are still possible, even if our husband turns out to be different than we expected." The casual way Kit said "our husband" made Margaret's stomach clench. The lawyers had been evasive about the details, but it was clear that both contracts were legally binding. Either they would both have to agree to nullify their arrangements, or somehow the three of them would have to work out an accommodation that satisfied the legal requirements. "I keep thinking about what people will say," Margaret admitted. "In Boston, reputation was everything. A scandal like this would ruin a woman forever." Kit laughed, a sound that held more bitterness than humor. "In Philadelphia, I was already ruined. That's why I answered Theodore's advertisement in the first place. Out here we can be whoever we choose to be. Nobody knows our histories, nobody cares about Eastern gossip. It's actually liberating if you think about it." Margaret envied Kit's confidence. The younger woman seemed to view their situation as an adventure rather than a disaster. Where Margaret saw obstacles and improprieties, Kit saw opportunities and freedom. Perhaps that was what frontier life required, the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. The hotel clerk entered with a telegram, his expression carefully neutral. Margaret had noticed that the hotel staff treated them with polite curiosity, clearly wondering what two unaccompanied ladies were doing in Denver and how long they intended to stay. Kit took the telegram and read it quickly, her expression growing thoughtful. "It's from the lawyers. Ezra Blackwood has agreed to meet with us. We're to travel to Bear Creek Trading Post, where arrangements will be made for transport to his cabin." Margaret felt her heart begin to race. "When?" "Day after tomorrow. The stagecoach leaves at dawn." The reality of their situation hit Margaret with fresh force. In 2 days, she would be traveling into the Colorado wilderness to meet a man who might become her husband, or who might reject her entirely. Everything she had known, everything she had planned, hung in the balance of that meeting. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered. Kit moved to kneel beside Margaret's chair, her expression gentle but determined. "Yes, you can. We both can. Whatever happens, we'll face it together. Theodore Blackwood chose us for a reason, and his nephew is bound by those contracts, whether he likes it or not." Margaret looked at her new friend and traveling companion, drawing strength from Kit's unwavering resolve. In the past 3 days, Kit had become the sister she had never had, supportive, protective, and refreshingly honest about their circumstances. "What if he chooses you?" Margaret asked the question that had been haunting her thoughts. "What if I come all this way only to be sent back east anyway?" Kit was quiet for a long moment. "Then you'll go back with enough money to start fresh somewhere new. The contract guarantees financial compensation even if the marriage doesn't work out. But Margaret, I don't think it will come to that. From what the lawyers told us, Ezra Blackwood is as trapped by this situation as we are." That evening, they made their preparations for the journey. Margaret carefully packed her few possessions, including the silk dress that now seemed like a relic from another life. She folded it between sheets of tissue paper, wondering if she would ever have occasion to wear it again. Kit's preparations were more practical. She had purchased sturdy boots, a warm cloak, and a riding skirt from one of Denver's outfitters. "If we're going to be frontier wives," she said with characteristic pragmatism, "we might as well dress the part." As night fell over Denver, Margaret lay in her narrow hotel bed and tried to imagine the man they would meet in 2 days. The lawyers had told them little beyond the fact that Ezra Blackwood was Theodore's nephew and heir, a man who lived alone in the mountains and made his living through mining and trapping. It painted a picture of someone very different from the refined businessman they had expected to marry. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of endless mountain vistas and a bearded stranger whose face she couldn't quite see. In her dreams, the silk dress became tattered and dirty, transforming from a symbol of Eastern refinement into evidence of her complete unsuitability for Western life. But when morning came, Margaret found her resolve stronger than her fears. Kit was already awake, standing at the window and watching the sunrise paint the distant mountains gold and pink. There was something in her posture that spoke of eagerness rather than dread, as if she were looking forward to whatever lay ahead. "Are you ready for this?" Kit asked without turning from the window. Margaret joined her at the window, looking out at the vast wilderness that would soon become her home. Somewhere in those mountains was a man whose life was about to be disrupted as thoroughly as their own. Whatever happened in the days ahead, there would be no going back to the lives they had left behind. "No," Margaret said honestly. "But I'm going anyway." Kit smiled, the expression transforming her face from pretty to beautiful. "That's the spirit. Whatever else happens, this won't be boring." As the sun climbed higher over the Colorado Territory, 2 women from very different backgrounds prepared to venture into the unknown. Their silk dresses and Eastern refinement would soon be tested against the harsh realities of mountain life, but they would face those tests together. In the space of 3 days, strangers had become allies, and allies might yet become family. The stagecoach would leave at dawn, carrying them toward a destiny none of them had chosen, but all of them would have to face. The Winchester rifle rested across Ezra's knees as he sat on the trading post's covered porch, its blue steel barrel gleaming in the afternoon sun. He had been waiting for 3 hours, ever since Murphy sent word that the stagecoach was approaching with its unusual cargo. The rifle wasn't for protection. No one threatened Ezra Blackwood in these mountains, but holding the familiar weight of the weapon steadied his nerves. Bear Creek trading post, squatted at the confluence of two mountain streams, a weathered collection of buildings that served the scattered population of miners, trappers and settlers who scratched out livings in the high country. Murphy's store occupied the largest building, its shelves stocked with everything from ammunition to patent medicine. A small stable housed horses and mules for rent, and a lean-to-kitchen provided hot meals for travelers who could afford them. Ezra had ridden down from his cabin that morning, leading his pack mule and carrying supplies he didn't really need. The trip had been an excuse to escape the oppressive silence of his home, where every familiar object now seemed to mock him with reminders of his solitary existence. In a few hours, two women would arrive expecting to marry him, and he still had no clear idea how to handle the situation. The sound of wheels and hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls, growing steadily louder. Ezra stood and leaned his rifle against the porch rail, straightening his shoulders in an unconscious gesture of preparation. He had bathed in the cold stream that morning and trimmed his beard with the same care he usually reserved for maintaining his traps. His clothes were clean, worn buckskins and a cotton shirt that had seen better days. But the best he owned. The stagecoach rounded the final bend and rolled into the trading post's dusty yard, its 4 horses blowing hard from the climb. The driver, a grizzled man named Henderson whom Ezra knew by sight, set the brake and climbed down from his perch. 2 passengers emerged from the coach's interior, and Ezra felt his world shift on its axis. The first woman to step down was clearly Margaret Sullivan. Her photograph hadn't captured the natural grace of her movements or the quiet dignity in her bearing. She wore a traveling dress of deep green wool, practical but well made, and her dark hair was arranged in a simple style that framed her intelligent face. She looked around the rough trading post with obvious uncertainty, but her expression showed determination rather than dismay. The second woman could only be Catherine O'Malley. Kit was smaller than Margaret, but carried herself with unmistakable confidence. Her auburn hair caught the light like burnished copper, and her green eyes took in every detail of her surroundings with obvious interest. She wore riding clothes, a divided skirt and sturdy boots that suggested she had given thought to the practical demands of frontier life. For a moment, the 3 of them simply stared at each other across the dusty yard. Ezra was acutely aware of how he must appear to these refined women, a rough mountain man with calloused hands and sun-weathered skin, as different from their deceased benefactor as a wolf from a house cat. Margaret spoke first, her voice carrying the cultured tones of Eastern education. "Mr. Blackwood, I presume?" Ezra nodded, suddenly conscious that his own voice would sound rusty from disuse. "Ma'am, both of you." He cleared his throat and tried again. "I reckon we need to talk." Kit stepped forward with characteristic directness. "I'm Catherine O'Malley, though I prefer Kit. This is Margaret Sullivan. I assume you've read our contracts and understand the situation we're all in." "I have," Ezra replied, appreciating her straightforward approach. "It's a complicated mess, and that's the truth." Murphy emerged from his store, drawn by the arrival of the stagecoach. He nodded to the women and gestured toward his establishment. "Ladies, you're welcome to freshen up inside while you folks sort things out. Got coffee hot and biscuits if you're hungry." Margaret's relief was obvious. "That would be very kind, thank you." As the women gathered their belongings from the stagecoach, Ezra found himself studying them with new eyes. Both were prettier than their photographs had suggested, but more importantly, both carried themselves with the kind of inner strength that suggested they might actually survive frontier life. Margaret's reserve spoke of careful thought and moral conviction, while Kit's energy suggested someone who embraced challenges rather than shying away from them. Inside Murphy's store, the atmosphere was awkward but not hostile. The women sat at the rough table Murphy used for meals, while Ezra remained standing, his hat in his hands. The sense of coffee and wood smoke filled the small space, creating an oddly domestic atmosphere despite the bizarre circumstances. "I want to be honest with both of you," Ezra began, his voice growing stronger as he warmed to his subject. "Theodore was my uncle, and I loved him, but he had no right to arrange marriages for me without my knowledge. You've been deceived, and I'm sorry for that. Margaret's face showed her disappointment clearly. Then you intend to nullify the contracts? I didn't say that. Ezra pulled up a chair and sat across from them, the movement bringing him into their circle rather than keeping him apart. The contracts are legal and binding. Theodore made commitments, and as his heir, I'm bound to honor them. The question is how we work this out in a way that's fair to everyone. Kit leaned forward, her interest clearly piqued. What are you proposing? Ezra had spent the better part of a week wrestling with this question, and his answer came slowly. My cabin isn't set up for 3 people. It would need to be expanded, made more comfortable. That would take time, maybe the whole summer. In the meantime, you could stay here at the trading post, get used to mountain life, decide if you want to go through with this. And then, Margaret asked quietly, then one of you marries me, and the other receives a settlement generous enough to start fresh wherever she chooses. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken implications. Both women understood that they were essentially in competition for security and a future, while the man they barely knew would have to choose between them. Kit broke the silence with typical bluntness. How would you decide? Draw straws? Flip a coin? Despite everything, Ezra found himself almost smiling at her irreverence. I was hoping we might get to know each other first. See if any of us actually suit, Margaret spoke with careful precision. You're suggesting a courtship? Under these circumstances, I'm suggesting we try to make the best of a situation none of us chose, Ezra replied. Theodore thought he was doing right by all of us. Maybe we can prove him right, or maybe we'll discover he was wrong. But we won't know unless we try. Kit stood and walked to the small window that looked out on the mountain peaks. What's your cabin like? How far from here? About 8 miles up the mountain. 1 room, stone fireplace, good well. I built it myself after my brother died. You lived alone all this time? Margaret asked, and there was something in her voice that might have been sympathy. 15 years, Ezra confirmed. Since the avalanche took Samuel. Kit turned from the window, her expression thoughtful. Show me your hands. Ezra blinked, confused by the unexpected request. Ma'am? Your hands. Show them to me. Ezra extended his hands, palms up. They were scarred from years of hard work, calloused from axe handles and rope, but clean and well kept. Kit examined them with the intensity of someone reading a book. These are working hands, she said finally. Capable hands. A man who builds his own cabin and lives alone in the mountains for 15 years isn't helpless or lazy. She looked up to meet his eyes. I can respect that. Margaret was studying Ezra's face with equal intensity. You said your brother died in an avalanche. Were you with him? The question hit like a physical blow, bringing back memories Ezra usually kept buried. Yes, we were checking our trapline when it came down. I tried to dig him out, but he stopped, unable to finish the sentence. I'm sorry, Margaret said quietly. That explains a great deal about why you chose isolation. Her understanding surprised him. Most people, when they heard about Samuel's death, offered empty platitudes or changed the subject. Margaret's simple acknowledgement of his pain felt like absolution. Murphy cleared his throat from behind the counter. Hate to interrupt, but I should mention that my wife could put the ladies up proper-like. We've got a spare room, and Sarah would welcome the female company. Kit and Margaret exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, Kit nodded. We'd be grateful for the accommodation, Mr. Murphy, and we'd be happy to pay for our keep. As afternoon faded toward evening, the 3 of them sat around Murphy's table and began the delicate process of getting acquainted. Ezra found himself talking more than he had in years, drawing out stories and memories he had thought lost forever. Margaret asked thoughtful questions about mountain life and the practical challenges of frontier living. Kit wanted to know about hunting and trapping, about the skills needed to survive in the wilderness. When full darkness fell, Ezra knew he needed to return to his cabin. The night ride would be dangerous, but staying at the trading post would force an intimacy he wasn't ready for. I'll be back tomorrow, he told them as he prepared to leave. We can continue this conversation then. Margaret stood as he reached for his hat. Mr. Blackwood, Ezra, thank you for being honest with us. This situation is difficult for everyone, but at least we're facing it with honor. Kit added her own farewell. "That's a fine rifle you carry. Maybe tomorrow you could show me how it handles." As Ezra rode up the mountain trail under a canopy of stars, he reflected on the strange turn his life had taken. 2 days ago, he had been a hermit with no human contact beyond Murphy's occasional visits. Now he was courting 2 women simultaneously, both of whom had traveled across a continent to marry him. Margaret Sullivan was everything her letters had suggested: intelligent, refined, and possessed of quiet strength. She would bring culture and learning to his rough existence, would civilize him in ways that might be good for his soul. Kit O'Malley was a revelation. Her spirit and practical nature suggested she might actually thrive in mountain life. There was something about her direct gaze and fearless questions that awakened feelings Ezra had thought dead and buried with Samuel. The problem, he realized as his cabin came into view, was that he was already beginning to care about both of them. The choice Theodore had forced upon him wasn't just a legal obligation. It was becoming an emotional minefield that could destroy all 3 of their lives. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations, and perhaps the beginning of answers to questions none of them had wanted to ask. But tonight, as Ezra unsaddled his horse and prepared for another solitary evening, he found that the silence of his cabin no longer felt like peace. It felt like emptiness waiting to be filled. Margaret's recipe book lay open on Murphy's kitchen table, its cream-colored pages filled with careful notations for delicate sauces and elaborate pastries that required ingredients unavailable within 1,000 miles of Bear Creek. She stared at the entry for lobster, thermidor, and felt a wave of despair wash over her. 3 weeks had passed since her arrival, and she was no closer to mastering the basic skills of frontier cooking than she had been on that first awkward day. "Don't look so discouraged," Sarah Murphy said kindly, stirring a pot of venison stew that actually smelled edible. "Takes time to learn new ways of doing things." Margaret closed the recipe book with a sigh. Every page reminded her of the comfortable life she had left behind, where servants handled the messy business of cooking over wood fires and preserving meat without ice. Her attempts to adapt Eastern cooking methods to frontier conditions had resulted in a series of culinary disasters that would have been comedic if they weren't so disheartening. Through the kitchen window, she could see Kit and Ezra down by the creek, where he was teaching her to clean the trout they had caught that morning. Kit's laughter carried on the mountain air, bright and joyful in a way that made Margaret's chest tighten with something she was reluctant to name as jealousy. The contrast between her own struggles and Kit's obvious aptitude for frontier life had become painfully clear over the past weeks. Where Margaret fumbled with unfamiliar tools and unfamiliar methods, Kit seemed to instinctively understand what mountain life required. She could start a fire without matches, mend torn clothing with neat stitches, and had even convinced Ezra to teach her basic marksmanship. "She's a natural," Sarah observed, following Margaret's gaze. "Some folks are just born to this life." Margaret nodded, trying to keep the bitterness from her voice. "Yes, she is." What made it worse was that Kit had been nothing but kind and supportive, celebrating Margaret's few successes and helping her through the failures without a trace of superiority. If anything, Kit seemed to go out of her way to include Margaret in activities where her education and refinement could shine, organizing evening discussions about literature, asking for help with writing letters, deferring to Margaret's judgment on matters of etiquette and propriety. But when it came to the practical skills that would determine who could truly thrive as Ezra's wife, the winner was obvious. Margaret had watched Ezra's face during Kit's shooting lesson yesterday, had seen the pride and admiration in his eyes as Kit consistently hit targets that would have challenged an experienced hunter. The same expression appeared when Kit helped him repair a damaged bridle, or when she instinctively knew to add more wood to a fire before it burned too low. With Margaret, Ezra was patient and encouraging, but she could see him struggling not to wince when she oversalted the beans, or when her attempts to milk Murphy's cow resulted in more milk on the ground than in the pail. He praised her efforts, but his praise felt like consolation prizes rather than genuine admiration. The kitchen door opened and Kit entered with her usual energetic stride, carrying a string of cleaned trout. Her riding skirt was damp from kneeling by the creek, and her cheeks were flushed from the mountain air. But she looked vibrantly alive in a way that made Margaret feel pale and inadequate by comparison. "These should make a lovely dinner," Kit announced, setting the fish on the preparation table. "Ezra showed me how to clean them properly. It's all in the angle of the knife." She paused, noticing Margaret's expression. "Is everything all right?" Margaret forced a smile. "Of course. I was just reviewing my recipes, trying to find something suitable for mountain cooking." Kit wiped her hands on a dish towel and moved to look over Margaret's shoulder at the open book. "Lobster thermidor. That sounds elegant. What's in it?" "Lobster, cream sauce, fine brandy, imported cheese," Margaret listed with growing despondency. "Nothing we can obtain here, in other words." "Then we'll have to adapt it," Kit said with characteristic optimism. "Use trout instead of lobster, maybe. Milk instead of cream? There must be ways to capture the essence of the dish using frontier ingredients." Sarah Murphy looked up from her stew pot with interest. "Now that's creative thinking. I'd be curious to see what you two could come up with working together." The suggestion sparked something in Margaret's mind. She had been so focused on what she couldn't do that she had overlooked what she could do. Her education and knowledge of cooking principles could be valuable if she learned to apply them creatively to available ingredients. "You're right," Margaret said, feeling a spark of her old confidence returning. "The techniques are what matter, not the specific ingredients." "I could modify the approach." Kit clapped her hands together. "Exactly. And I can help with the practical parts, getting the fire temperature right, timing everything properly. We make a good team." As they began planning their experimental dinner, Margaret felt some of her jealousy ebbing away. Kit wasn't trying to outshine her. She genuinely wanted both of them to succeed. The younger woman's competitive spirit seemed focused on conquering the challenges of frontier life, rather than on competing for Ezra's attention. But even as Margaret appreciated Kit's friendship, she couldn't ignore the growing bond between Kit and Ezra. They shared an easy camaraderie that came from similar temperaments and compatible skills. When they worked together, whether cleaning fish or planning trap routes, they moved with an unconscious synchronization that spoke of natural partnership. Margaret, by contrast, felt like she was constantly swimming upstream. Every task required careful instruction. Every skill had to be learned from scratch. She was grateful for Ezra's patience, but she could see that her struggles exhausted him. He never complained, but she noticed the slight slump of his shoulders when she failed at something that should have been simple. The careful way he rephrased instructions when her first attempts went wrong. Late that afternoon, while Kit and Ezra were checking the trap lines, Margaret sat on the trading post's porch and forced herself to confront an uncomfortable truth. She had come west expecting to marry a prosperous businessman who would appreciate her refinement and education. Instead, she found herself competing for a mountain man who needed a partner, capable of sharing the harsh realities of wilderness. Life.Kit emerged from those realities like a wildflower pushing through. Snow, natural, resilient, and surprisingly beautiful. Margaret felt more like a hothouse orchid, exotic perhaps, but fundamentally unsuited to the climate. The sound of returning horses broke her melancholy reverie. Ezra and Kit rode into the trading post yard, their saddlebags heavy with the day's catch. They were deep in conversation about something that had Kit gesturing animatedly, and Ezra was actually smiling, a rare expression that transformed his weathered features. Margaret watched them dismount and tend to their horses with practiced efficiency, noting how they worked together without need for discussion. Kit handed Ezra tools before he asked for them, and he automatically steadied her stirrup as she loosened her saddle. These small courtesies spoke of a growing intimacy that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with genuine compatibility. "Good day?" Margaret asked as they approached the porch. "Excellent," Kit replied enthusiastically. "We found sign of a beaver colony up the North Fork." Ezra thinks it might be worth setting traps there come winter. Kit has good instincts for reading animal sign, Ezra added. Spotted tracks I almost missed. The pride in his voice was unmistakable, and Margaret felt her heart sink another notch. When Ezra spoke about her accomplishments, her knowledge of literature, her ability to calculate accounts in her head, her skill at letter writing, his tone was respectful, but distant. When he spoke about Kit's achievements, warmth crept into his voice, despite his efforts to remain neutral. That evening, Margaret and Kit collaborated on dinner, adapting one of Margaret's recipes to use trout, wild onions, and herbs Kit had identified during their ride. The result was surprisingly successful, a creamy fish dish that earned genuine praise from both Murphy and Ezra. Now, this is what I call fine cooking, Murphy declared, savoring another bite. You ladies make quite a team. Margaret felt a flush of pleasure at the compliment, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the partnership had succeeded primarily because of Kit's practical skills. Margaret had provided the theoretical knowledge, but Kit had made it work in practice. After dinner, as had become their custom, the three of them sat on the porch and talked while the mountain sunset painted the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. These conversations had become the highlight of Margaret's days, a chance to contribute meaningfully using her education and intellectual curiosity. Tonight, Kit was asking about Ezra's mining operation, clearly fascinated by the technical aspects of extracting silver from rock. Her questions were intelligent and practical, focused on the tools and techniques required rather than the romantic notion of striking it rich. The silver vein runs along the creek bed, Ezra explained, sketching rough diagrams in the dust with a stick. Water helps separate the ore from the surrounding rock, but it also makes the work dangerous. Flash floods can come down without warning. Kit studied the diagram intently. Is that what happened to your brother? A flood. Margaret held her breath. In 3 weeks, none of them had dared ask directly about Samuel's death. Ezra's face darkened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. No, he said finally. We were checking trap lines on the ridge above the mine. Warm weather had made the snow unstable. Samuel heard it coming first, always had better ears than me. He pushed me clear, but couldn't get out of the way himself. The pain in his voice was raw and immediate, as if 15 years had compressed into 15 minutes. Kit reached out without thinking and briefly touched his hand, a gesture of comfort so natural that Margaret felt a sharp pang of envy. I'm sorry, Kit said simply. He saved your life and lost his own doing it. Ezra pulled his hand away, but gently. I've spent 15 years wondering if I could have saved him instead, Margaret found her voice. Survivor's guilt is a heavy burden. You can't carry responsibility for natural disasters or other people's choices. Ezra looked at her with surprise, as if he hadn't expected such understanding from someone who had never faced real hardship. You sound like you know something about guilt. I do. Margaret chose her words carefully. When my parents died of consumption, I convinced myself that if I had been a better daughter, if I had prayed harder or tended them more carefully, they might have lived. It took years to understand that some things are beyond our control. The conversation continued deep into the evening, touching on loss, guilt, and the ways people found to continue living after tragedy. For the first time since arriving in Colorado, Margaret felt that she was contributing something valuable, not practical skills, but emotional understanding and intellectual perspective. When they finally retired for the night, Margaret lay in her narrow bed and reflected on the day's revelations. Kit was clearly winning the competition for Ezra's affections, but perhaps there were different kinds of winning. Margaret might not be the woman Ezra would choose to share his bed, but she could be someone who shared his thoughts, someone who understood the deeper currents of his emotional life. It wasn't the future she had imagined when she signed Theodore's contract, but it might be a future worth having nonetheless. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to prove her worth, even if that worth was measured differently than she had expected. Outside her window, the mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of snow from the high peaks. Winter was still months away, But Margaret could feel the seasonal rhythm that governed life in this harsh, beautiful country. She was learning to read those rhythms, just as she was learning to read the complex emotions that bound three lonely people together in an impossible situation. Change was coming. She could feel it in the wind. The hidden locket felt cold against Kit's skin as she sat by the creek, watching the first autumn leaves drift down from the aspen trees. 6 weeks had passed since their arrival at Bear Creek, and the easy routines of mountain life had begun to feel like home. But the weight of the locket reminded her that home was an illusion she couldn't afford to embrace completely. Inside the delicate gold case was a photograph that could destroy everything. She had found here a daguerreotype of a man whose death had driven her from Philadelphia and across a continent. Thomas Hartwell had been a good man, an honest bookkeeper who had stumbled onto evidence of corruption in the municipal contracts office. He had confided in Kit because he trusted her, because he thought she could help him decide what to do with the information. She had advised him to take his evidence to the authorities. 3 days later, he was found dead in an alley behind his boarding house, allegedly the victim of a robbery gone wrong. But Kit knew better. Thomas had shown her the names in his ledger: city officials, contractors, judges, all part of a web of corruption that reached into the highest levels of Philadelphia society. The night after Thomas's funeral, Kit's guardian had summoned her to his study. Judge William Ashford had raised her after her parents' death, provided her with education and comfort, and she had loved him like a father. But that night, his face had been cold and calculating as he explained her situation. "Young Thomas was foolish to involve you in his troubles," the judge had said. "Fortunately, his death has solved the immediate problem. But there are those who might wonder what he told you before his unfortunate demise." Kit had stared at the man she thought she knew, seeing him clearly for the first time. "You're part of it. The corruption," Thomas discovered. "I am a practical man who understands how cities function," Ashford had replied. "And you, my dear, are a young woman who will learn to be equally practical. You will forget whatever Thomas might have told you, and you will never speak of these matters to anyone." But Kit couldn't forget, and Ashford knew it. Within a week, he had arranged for her to answer Theodore Blackwood's advertisement for a frontier bride. The marriage contract was his solution, a way to remove Kit from Philadelphia while maintaining plausible deniability about her departure. "You'll have a good life in Colorado," he had told her as she prepared to leave. "Much better than anything you could expect here, especially given the circumstances. I suggest you focus on your future rather than dwelling on unfortunate events you cannot change." The threat had been clear. If she ever returned to Philadelphia, if she ever spoke about what Thomas had discovered, her life would be worth no more than his had been. Now, sitting by the mountain creek with the autumn sun warm on her face, Kit touched the locket and wondered what Thomas would think of the woman she had become. She had found happiness here, had discovered skills and strengths she never knew she possessed. More troubling, she had found herself falling in love with a man who believed she was exactly what she appeared to be, a spirited young woman seeking adventure in the western territories. The sound of footsteps on the rocky creek bank made her quickly tuck the locket back beneath her shirt. Ezra appeared around a bend in the trail, carrying his fishing gear and wearing the easy smile that had become familiar over the past weeks. "Thought I might find you here," he said, settling beside her on the smooth boulder she had claimed as her favorite thinking spot. "Margaret's helping Sarah with the bread baking, so I figured this was a good time for that fishing lesson you wanted." Kit forced herself to match his cheerful tone. "Perfect timing. I've been watching the water, trying to see where the fish like to hide." As Ezra rigged his line and explained the finer points of mountain stream fishing, Kit found herself memorizing his voice, the careful way he demonstrated each technique, the patience he showed when her first attempts tangled the line hopelessly. These moments had become precious to her, glimpses of the man he had been before grief and isolation hardened him. "You're a natural at this," he said, as she successfully cast her line into a promising pool. "Better than I was when Samuel first taught me." It was the first time he had mentioned his brother without pain shadowing his features. And Kit felt a warm surge of pride at being trusted with such memories. "Tell me about him," she said, keeping her voice casual as she watched her line drift downstream. "What was Samuel like?" Ezra was quiet for so long that Kit wondered if she had overstepped. Then he began to speak, his words coming slowly at first, then with growing warmth as he described the brother who had been his best friend and closest companion. "Samuel could make friends with a grizzly bear," Ezra said with a chuckle. "He had this way of talking to people that made them feel like the most interesting person in the world. Complete opposite of me in that regard." "I think you underestimate yourself," Kit said, meaning it. "You've been incredibly patient with both Margaret and me, helping us learn to survive out here. That's different. You two are—" He paused, searching for words. "You're both remarkable women. It's been a privilege getting to know you." The careful neutrality in his tone made Kit's heart ache. She knew Ezra was struggling with the impossible choice Theodore had forced upon him, and she could see the strain it was causing. Margaret was clearly struggling with frontier life, but she was also proving herself to be intelligent, thoughtful, and genuinely kind. Kit respected her rival even as she hoped to defeat her. "Ezra," Kit said carefully, "what happens when winter comes?" "We can't stay at the trading post indefinitely." His jaw tightened. "I know. I've been thinking about that." He reeled in his line and cast again, the motion sharp with suppressed tension. "The cabin needs work before the snow flies. More room, better insulation. It'll take most of the remaining good weather to get it ready. And then I suppose we'll have to make some decisions." Kit felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "About which one of us you'll marry." Ezra was quiet for a long moment, his attention seemingly focused on his fishing line. "It's not that simple anymore," he said finally. "When this whole situation started, I thought it would be a matter of choosing which woman could best adapt to mountain life. But both of you have adapted, just in different ways." Kit's heart began to race. "What do you mean?" "Margaret brings things to this life that I didn't know I was missing. Intelligence, culture, a different way of looking at the world. When she talks about books or ideas, it reminds me that there's more to existence than just survival." Kit felt her hopes begin to crumble. But Ezra wasn't finished. "And you," he said, turning to look at her directly, "you make me remember what it feels like to have a partner. Someone who understands this life instinctively, who can share the work and the hardships without making them feel like burdens." "But," Kit prompted, hearing the hesitation in his voice, "but it's not just about compatibility or practical skills. There's something else, something that—" He trailed off, seeming to struggle with words that had no precise meaning. Kit thought she understood what he couldn't say. There was attraction between them, a growing emotional connection that went beyond friendship or partnership. She felt it too, a pull that had nothing to do with legal contracts or practical considerations. "I know," she said quietly. "I feel it too." The admission hung between them like a confession, changing the nature of their conversation from practical to deeply personal. Ezra's fishing line drifted forgotten as he studied her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Kit," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a caress. "I need you to know that whatever happens, whatever decision gets made, it won't be because you aren't enough," she supplied when he struggled for words. "Perfect," he said simply. "For this life, for me, you're perfect. But Margaret deserves consideration too, and I won't make this choice lightly." Kit nodded, understanding more than he realized. The weight of her hidden locket seemed to grow heavier as she contemplated the irony of her situation. She was falling in love with a man who valued honesty above all else, while hiding a secret that could endanger them all. That evening, as the three of them shared dinner at Murphy's table, Kit watched Margaret with new eyes. The older woman was beginning to find her place in mountain life, contributing her own strengths to their unconventional household. She had taken over the trading post's bookkeeping, bringing organization and efficiency to Murphy's chaotic record-keeping. She helped Sarah with the more complex cooking, adapting Eastern recipes to frontier ingredients with increasing success. More importantly, Margaret was becoming a friend, someone Kit genuinely cared about and respected. The thought of competing against her for Ezra's affections felt increasingly uncomfortable, especially knowing that Margaret's feelings were becoming as engaged as her own. After dinner, Kit excused herself early and walked out into the crisp autumn evening. The stars were brilliant in the thin mountain air, and she could smell snow on the wind from the high peaks. Winter was coming, bringing with it decisions that would change all their lives. She touched the locket through her shirt and made a silent promise to Thomas Hartwell's memory. Whatever choice she made about her future, she would make it honestly. If she was going to compete for Ezra's love, it would be as herself, all of herself, including the dangerous secrets she carried. The question was whether Ezra and Margaret could accept the truth about who she really was and why she had come west, and whether telling that truth would destroy the new life she had found in the Colorado mountains. Time was running out for deception, just as it was running out for summer. Soon, very soon, all their secrets would have to come into the light. The wanted poster was crumpled and travel-stained, but the image was unmistakably clear. Kit's heart stopped as she stared at her own face sketched in black ink above words that made her blood run cold. Wanted for questioning Catherine Elizabeth O'Malley. Reward $500. Contact Federal Marshal's Office, Philadelphia. Murphy held the poster with obvious reluctance, his weathered face grim in the trading post's lamplight. 3 men rode in this afternoon while you folks were up at the mine. Federal Marshals, they said, asking questions about a young woman matching your description. The small group gathered in Murphy's store felt the weight of the moment. Ezra stood behind Kit's chair, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. Margaret sat across the table, her face pale but determined. Sarah Murphy busied herself with unnecessary tasks, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden tension that had invaded her peaceful domain. "What did you tell them?" Ezra asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Told them I hadn't seen anyone matching that description," Murphy replied. "But they're not fools, and they're not giving up easy. They're camped down by Willow Creek, and they've sent word to the other trading posts in the territory." Kit forced herself to breathe steadily as she examined the poster more closely. The sketch was accurate enough that anyone who knew her would recognize it immediately. Below her image, the text described her as a material witness in a federal investigation of municipal corruption. There was no mention of murder, but Kit knew that was merely a tactical omission. "Kit," Margaret said gently, "perhaps you should tell us what this is really about." The moment Kit had been dreading for months had finally arrived. She looked around the circle of faces, people who had become her family, her anchor in a turbulent world, and knew that her deception was about to cost her everything she had found here. "My real name is Catherine Elizabeth O'Malley," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the rest of what I told you isn't entirely true." She told them about Thomas Hartwell, about the evidence he had discovered, about his death and Judge Ashford's threats. The words came easier than she had expected, as if she had been rehearsing this confession for months. When she finished, the silence in the room was deafening. Ezra was the first to speak. "You witnessed a murder. I believe Thomas was murdered, yes. But I have no proof beyond my certainty that his death was too convenient for the men he was investigating. And you came west to escape these people?" Margaret asked. "Judge Ashford arranged it. He thought marriage to a frontier businessman would solve his problem, removing me from Philadelphia while making it look like a natural choice rather than exile." Kit's laugh was bitter. "He had no idea he was sending me to exactly the kind of man who would value honesty above everything else." Ezra's hand tightened on her shoulder. "Why didn't you tell us?" "We could have what?" Kit interrupted. "Hidden a federal fugitive? Lied to law enforcement? I've already brought enough danger into your lives without asking you to become accessories." Margaret leaned forward, her expression intense. "Kit, if you're a material witness to corruption, why are you running? Why not testify and help bring these criminals to justice?" "Because Thomas is dead, and they'll kill me too if I try to expose them. Judge Ashford has connections throughout the federal system. These marshals might be honest, or they might be in Ashford's pocket. I have no way of knowing which. Murphy cleared his throat. Well, honest or not, they're getting suspicious. Asked a lot of specific questions about Eastern women, about new arrivals, about anyone who might be traveling under an assumed name. How long before they figure out where I am? Kit asked. Hard to say. Could be days, could be weeks. Depends on how determined they are and how much help they get from local folks. Ezra moved to the window and peered out into the darkness. 3 men, you said? 3 that I saw. Could be more. Kit felt the walls closing in around her. For months, she had allowed herself to believe that distance and time would protect her, that she could build a new life far from the corruption and violence of Philadelphia. But the long arm of federal law enforcement had finally reached into the Colorado mountains. I have to leave, she said quietly. Tonight, if possible. Before they connect me to the trading post. No! Ezra's voice was firm. Running will only make you look guilty. I am guilty, Kit replied. Of obstruction of justice, of fleeing federal investigators, of lying to federal agents about my identity. If they take me back to Philadelphia, Judge Ashford will make sure I disappear, just like Thomas did. Margaret stood and began pacing, her mind clearly working through the implications. There has to be another way. If you're truly a material witness to federal crimes, there must be someone in the government who would protect you in exchange for your testimony. Who? Kit asked desperately. I don't know which officials can be trusted. For all I know, these marshals have orders to make sure I never reach a courtroom alive. Sarah Murphy, who'd been quietly listening from behind the counter, finally spoke up. What about the territorial governor? Federal marshals have to answer to him when they're operating in Colorado. He might be able to sort out whether these men are legitimate or not. Murphy nodded thoughtfully. Sarah's got a point. Governor's office in Denver might be able to verify whether this is a legitimate federal investigation or something else entirely. Kit felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly extinguished by practical concerns. Even if the governor could help, how would we reach him? Those marshals are watching the roads, and Denver is 3 days' ride under the best conditions. We could get word to him, Ezra said, his tactical mind clearly engaging with the problem. Murphy knows people on the Denver route. A message could reach the governor's office faster than you could travel there yourself. And in the meantime, Kit asked, in the meantime, we keep you safe and hidden until we know who we're dealing with. Margaret stopped pacing and turned to face the group. There's something else to consider. If Kit is right about Judge Ashford's corruption, then she's not just running from personal danger. She's carrying evidence that could expose criminals in positions of power. That makes her valuable to the right people. Kit pulled the locket from beneath her shirt and opened it, revealing Thomas Hartwell's photograph. This is all the evidence I have. A picture of a dead man and my word about what he told me. Sometimes that's enough, Ezra said grimly. Especially if there are other people willing to come forward once they see someone taking a stand. Murphy stood and moved to his safe, returning with a sheet of paper and a pencil. I'll write to my contact in Denver tonight. He can get word to the governor's office, explain the situation, ask for guidance. But it'll take time. How much time? Kit asked. At least a week, maybe more. Kit felt despair settling over her like a heavy blanket. A week was longer than her luck was likely to hold. The marshals would eventually expand their search, would ask more pointed questions, would find someone willing to talk in exchange for the reward money. There's another option, Ezra said quietly. We could take you up to my cabin. It's isolated, defensible, and I know the country better than any federal marshal ever will. If they want you, they'll have to come through me to get you. The protective edge in his voice made Kit's heart ache. She had never wanted to drag Ezra into her troubles, but circumstances had made that choice for her. I can't ask you to do that, she said. You'd be harboring a fugitive, obstructing federal agents. It could cost you everything. You're not asking, Ezra replied. I'm offering. And Margaret's right. If you're carrying evidence of federal corruption, then protecting you might be the right thing to do, regardless of the personal cost. Margaret moved to stand beside Ezra, her expression resolute. He won't be doing it alone. I'm with you, Kit. Whatever happens. Kit stared at her two companions, the man she loved and the woman who had become her dearest friend, and felt overwhelmed by their loyalty. They were willing to risk everything for her, to stand against federal authority based on nothing more than her word and their faith in her character. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this for me?" Ezra knelt beside her chair and took her hands in his. "Because 3 months ago, I was a dead man walking through the motions of living. You and Margaret brought me back to life, reminded me what it means to care about other people. I won't abandon either of you when you need help." Margaret nodded her agreement. "We're family now, Kit. Chosen family maybe, but family nonetheless. That means we protect each other." Outside, the mountain wind picked up, rattling the trading post's windows and carrying the promise of early snow. Winter was coming, and with it would come a test of everything they had built together over the past months. Kit closed the locket and tucked it away, feeling the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. She could run again, disappear into the vast wilderness, and hope to stay ahead of pursuit. Or she could trust the people who had become her family, allow them to help her face the danger that had followed her across a continent. "All right," she said finally. "But if this goes wrong, if we're caught, I want both of you to know that what happened between us, these months we've shared, they've been the happiest of my life." Ezra squeezed her hands. "Then we'd better make sure it doesn't go wrong." As they began planning their withdrawal to the mountain cabin, Kit reflected on the bitter irony of her situation. She had come west to escape her past, only to discover that the past could never truly be escaped. But perhaps it could be faced with the help of people who cared enough to stand beside her against whatever was coming. The wanted poster lay forgotten on Murphy's table, but its message was clear. Catherine O'Malley's reckoning had finally arrived. The military compass had belonged to Ezra's father, carried through the Mexican War and passed down with the kind of reverence reserved for family heirlooms. Now it rested in Ezra's palm as he studied the topographical map spread across his cabin's table, its brass face catching the lamplight as he plotted escape routes through the treacherous mountain passes. "The Devil's Backbone Trail is our best option," he said, tracing a thin line that wound through the highest peaks. "It's dangerous this time of year, but the marshals won't expect us to take it, especially with women in the party." Kit leaned over his shoulder to study the map, her presence both comforting and distracting. "How dangerous?" "Dangerous enough that most folks won't attempt it after the first snow," Ezra admitted. "Narrow ledges, loose rock, weather that can change from clear to blizzard in minutes. But I've traveled it before, and it leads to an old mining camp where we could hole up until this situation resolves itself." Margaret examined the compass with obvious fascination. "This is beautiful workmanship. How accurate is it in these mountains?" "Accurate enough to keep us alive if we're careful." Ezra closed the compass and slipped it into his shirt pocket. "My father always said a good compass and a clear head could get a man through anything." The three of them had been at the cabin for 4 days, ever since Murphy's midnight warning had sent them fleeing up the mountain trails under cover of darkness. The cabin that had once seemed spacious for one person now felt cramped with 3 occupants, but they had made it work through careful coordination and mutual respect. Margaret had taken charge of supplies and logistics, using her organizational skills to inventory their food stores and plan for an extended stay in the wilderness. Kit had focused on weapons and ammunition, cleaning Ezra's rifles and pistols with the thoroughness of someone who understood that their lives might depend on the reliability of their firearms. Ezra had spent his time preparing defensive positions and escape routes, drawing on military knowledge he had hoped never to use again. His brief service in the Civil War had taught him the value of preparation and the importance of having multiple contingency plans. Outside, the weather was deteriorating. Snow had begun falling that morning. Not the gentle flurries of early autumn, but the heavy, determined snowfall that marked winter's arrival in the high country. By Ezra's calculation, they had perhaps 2 days before the higher passes became impassable. "We need to make a decision," Margaret said, voicing what they were all thinking. Stay and fight or run while we still can. Kit moved to the window and peered out at the swirling snow. Any word from Murphy about the governor's response? Ezra shook his head. The snow's cut us off from the trading post. Won't be any messages getting through until this storm passes. The isolation was both blessing and curse. The storm would make it nearly impossible for the federal marshals to reach the cabin, but it also meant they had no way of knowing what was happening in the world below. For all they knew, more agents had arrived, or the territorial governor had issued orders for their arrest. I keep thinking about what Margaret said, Kit mused, still staring out at the storm. About me being valuable to the right people. What if we're approaching this wrong? What if instead of running from the marshals, we should be trying to make contact with them on our terms? Margaret looked up from the supply list she was compiling. You mean arrange a meeting? Try to negotiate? Something like that. If they're legitimate federal agents investigating corruption, then my testimony could help them. If they're working for Judge Ashford, then we'll find out quickly enough. Ezra felt his stomach clench at the suggestion. That's a hell of a risk, Kit. If you're wrong about their intentions, you'll be dead before you can change your mind. And if I'm right, this whole nightmare could be over. Kit turned from the window, her green eyes bright with determination. I'm tired of running, Ezra. Tired of looking over my shoulder, tired of dragging you and Margaret into danger. Maybe it's time to face this head-on. The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made all three of them freeze. The distant crack of a rifle shot, echoing off the canyon walls despite the muffling effect of the snow. Ezra moved to the window and peered out, his trained eye searching for movement in the white landscape. Could be a hunter, Margaret suggested hopefully. Ezra was already reaching for his Winchester. Not in this weather. Nobody hunts in a blizzard unless they're hunting people. 2 more shots followed, closer this time and from different directions. Ezra felt his military instincts take over as he assessed their tactical situation. The cabin was well positioned, with good fields of fire and limited approaches, but it was also a trap if they were surrounded. How many? Kit asked, checking the load on the pistol Ezra had given her. At least 3, maybe more. They're spread out, trying to surround us. Ezra moved to the back window and spotted movement in the trees. Professional work. These aren't local deputies. Margaret was surprisingly calm, methodically gathering important papers and stuffing them into a waterproof pouch. What do we do? We get out while we still can, Ezra replied, his mind already working through their options. The back trail is still clear, but not for long. We take what we can carry and make for the high country. Kit was at the front window now, rifle in hand. They're closer than you think. I can see at least 2 men moving up the main trail, Ezra cursed under his breath. The marshals had moved faster than he expected, had pushed through the storm with a determination that spoke of either dedication to duty or desperation to silence Kit before she could talk. We need to buy ourselves time, he said, moving to the cabin's central support beam where he had cached additional ammunition. Kit, watch the front approach. Margaret, keep an eye on the south window. I'll cover the back. As they took their positions, Ezra's mind raced through their dwindling options. The storm was both ally and enemy. It would cover their escape, but also make travel treacherous. The high mountain passes that represented safety were also death traps in blizzard conditions. A voice called out from the swirling snow, amplified by the canyon walls. "Catherine O'Malley! This is Deputy Marshal Williams. We're here on federal business. Come out and talk to us." Kit's jaw tightened. Deputy Marshal Williams. I remember that name from some of Judge Ashford's papers. He's dirty. Ezra felt a cold certainty settle over him. If the marshals were corrupt, then Kit's fears had been justified all along. There would be no negotiation, no legal resolution. Just survival or death, Miss O'Malley, the voice continued. We know you're in there. We just want to talk. Come out and nobody gets hurt. Kit moved away from the window and began gathering her few possessions. We all know how that conversation would end. How long before they lose patience and rush the cabin? Not long, Ezra replied grimly. They're exposed out there in the storm. They'll want to finish this quickly. Margaret finished packing their essential supplies into backpacks, her movements efficient despite the obvious strain. The escape route you mentioned, how far is it? Half a mile through the trees to the base of Devil's Backbone. From there, it's a 3-hour climb to the old mining camp, assuming the weather holds. And if it doesn't hold, Ezra met her eyes honestly, then we die on the mountain instead of in the cabin. But at least we die free. Another rifle shot cracked through the air, and this time they heard the bullet strike the cabin's log wall. The marshals were moving closer, testing their defenses and growing bolder. Time to go, Ezra announced, shouldering his pack and checking his rifle one final time. Kit, you're in the middle. Margaret, stay close behind her. I'll bring up the rear and watch for pursuit. They moved to the cabin's back door, where Ezra had prepared an escape route through the adjoining woodshed. The plan was simple. Slip out through the woodshed's back wall, use the storm for cover, and reach the tree line before the marshals realized they were gone. Kit paused at the doorway, her hand on the latch. Ezra, if something happens to me out there, if we get separated, or if I don't make it, I want you to know that these past months have been the best of my life. Both of you have given me something I never thought I'd have. Nothing's going to happen, Ezra said firmly. We're all getting out of this together. Margaret squeezed Kit's shoulder. He's right. We've come too far to lose each other now. The back door opened silently on well-oiled hinges, and they slipped into the woodshed's dim interior. Ezra had loosened several boards on the back wall weeks ago, creating an exit that was invisible from outside, but could be quickly opened from within. The storm hit them like a physical blow as they emerged into the blizzard. Snow drove horizontally across the mountainside, reducing visibility to mere yards and numbing exposed skin within seconds. Ezra took point, using his compass to navigate toward the tree line while Kit and Margaret followed in his footsteps. Behind them, shouts erupted from around the cabin as the marshals discovered their escape. Ezra heard orders being barked, men spreading out to search the immediate area. But the storm was their ally now, masking their tracks and muffling sounds. They reached the tree line just as rifle shots began echoing through the forest behind them. The marshals were shooting blind, hoping to flush them out or get lucky with a random shot. Ezra pushed deeper into the timber, following deer trails and creek beds that would confuse their pursuers. How much farther? Margaret gasped, the altitude and exertion clearly taking their toll. Another quarter-mile to the base of the trail, Ezra replied, pausing to let her catch her breath. The hard part comes after that. Kit was checking their back trail, her rifle ready. I think we lost them, at least temporarily. But they'll pick up our trail once the storm passes, Ezra nodded grimly. The marshals were experienced trackers, and 3 people moving through snow would leave signs that any competent tracker could follow. Their only hope was to reach the mining camp before pursuit caught up. They pressed on through the increasingly treacherous terrain, each step taking them higher into the storm. The trees began to thin as they climbed, giving way to bare rock and treacherous ledges where a single misstep could mean a fatal fall. The entrance to Devil's Backbone Trail was marked by a crude wooden sign, half buried in snow and barely visible in the whiteout conditions. Ezra felt a moment of doubt as he contemplated the narrow path that wound along the cliff face. In good weather, it was challenging. In a blizzard, it was suicidal. This is it, he announced, having to shout to be heard over the wind. From here on, we rope together. If one of us falls, the others might be able to arrest the fall. As they prepared for the most dangerous part of their escape, Ezra reflected on the strange turn his life had taken. 6 months ago, he had been a hermit with no human connections beyond occasional visits to the trading post. Now he was risking everything to protect 2 women who had become more important to him than his own life. Margaret was tying the safety rope around her waist with the methodical precision that had made her such a valuable addition to their group. Kit was checking her weapons one final time, her face set with the determination that had carried her across a continent. Whatever happens up there, Ezra said, gesturing toward the invisible trail that disappeared into the storm, I want you both to know that you've given my life meaning again. For the first time since Samuel died, I have something worth fighting for. Kit smiled through the driving snow. Then let's make sure we all survive to appreciate it. As they began the treacherous climb up Devil's Backbone, Ezra felt the weight of the compass in his pocket, a tangible link to his father's wisdom and his own military training. The storm was worsening, their pursuers were determined, and the trail ahead was fraught with mortal danger, but they were together, and they were free. For now, that was enough. The mountain would test them in ways they couldn't imagine. But they would face those tests as they had faced everything else, as a family bound by choice rather than blood, united by love and tempered by shared adversity. Behind them, the sound of pursuit was swallowed by the storm. Ahead lay the unknown, fraught with danger but also with the possibility of redemption. The compass needle pointed true north, towards safety and toward hope. The abandoned silver mine clung to the mountainside like a wound in the rock, its entrance partially collapsed, but still providing shelter from the howling blizzard. Ezra's brother Samuel had died in a mine much like this one, and the irony wasn't lost on him as he led Kit and Margaret into the dark tunnel that might save their lives. Samuel's mining tools still lay scattered where Ezra had left them 15 years ago, picks, shovels, and iron bars that had been too painful to retrieve after the avalanche. Now as he gathered them to create defensive positions, Ezra felt his brother's presence like a blessing. Samuel had always been the optimist, the one who believed things would work out for the best. "How deep does this go?" Kit asked, her voice echoing strangely in the narrow space. "About 50 yards to the main chamber," Ezra replied, arranging loose rocks into a makeshift barricade near the entrance. "There's a water seepage that never freezes, and the back tunnel connects to an old ventilation shaft. Multiple ways in and out, if we need them." Margaret was examining the mining equipment with professional interest. "These tools are in remarkable condition for their age." Samuel took care of his equipment. Ezra's voice caught slightly. "Said a miner's tools were his lifeline, and a man who didn't respect his lifeline deserved whatever happened to him." The storm had covered their tracks for most of the ascent up Devil's Backbone. But Ezra knew their pursuers wouldn't give up easily. Deputy Marshal Williams and his men were too close to their goal, and the reward for Kit's capture, dead or alive, was apparently worth risking their lives in a blizzard. "They'll wait for the storm to pass," Kit said, checking the sight on her rifle. "But once it does, they'll come up that trail. How defensible is this position?" Ezra pointed to the mine entrance. "Good fields of fire, limited approaches. The trail below is narrow enough that they'll have to come at a single file for the last 100 yards. But if they get inside, then we use the back exit," Margaret finished. "How far does that ventilation shaft go?" "Comes out about a quarter-mile down the back slope. It's a tight squeeze, but manageable." As they settled in to wait, Ezra found himself studying his two companions with new eyes. The refined Eastern ladies who had arrived at Bear Creek 6 months ago had been transformed by hardship into capable frontier women. Margaret's careful planning and organizational skills had kept them supplied and prepared. Kit's natural fighting instincts and practical knowledge had become invaluable assets. But more than their skills, it was their courage that amazed him. Neither woman had asked to be thrust into this situation. Yet both had faced danger with the kind of quiet bravery that reminded Ezra why he had fallen in love with the untamed West. "I've been thinking," Margaret said quietly, breaking the silence that had settled over their makeshift camp, "about what Kit said earlier, about facing this situation head-on." Kit looked up from cleaning her pistol. "You think I was wrong?" "No, I think you were right. But I also think you were planning to sacrifice yourself to protect us." Margaret's voice carried the firmness of absolute conviction. "That's not acceptable." Ezra felt his chest tighten. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if we're going to face these marshals, we do it together. All of us, or none of us." Margaret moved to the mine entrance and peered out at the storm. "Kit has evidence of federal corruption. That makes her valuable alive and dangerous dead. We need to find a way to turn that to our advantage." Kit stood and joined Margaret at the entrance. "I've been thinking the same thing. If Williams is working for Judge Ashford, then he's here to silence me permanently. But if we can prove that connection, then we expose the entire conspiracy," Ezra finished. But how do we prove it without getting killed in the process? Margaret smiled, and for the first time since the pursuit began, Ezra saw something other than fear in her expression. We make them prove it themselves. As Margaret outlined her plan, Ezra felt a mixture of admiration and terror. It was brilliant, audacious, and completely insane. It also might be their only chance of survival. The plan relied on several assumptions: that Williams was indeed corrupt, that he would want to silence Kit permanently, and that his corruption extended to falsifying federal documents. If any of those assumptions were wrong, they would all die on this mountain. But if Margaret was right, they could turn the tables on their pursuers and expose the conspiracy that had driven Kit into exile. It's risky, Kit said when Margaret finished explaining. Everything we've done for the past week has been risky, Margaret replied. At least this way, we're taking the initiative instead of just reacting. Ezra studied the two women who had come to mean everything to him. 6 months ago, the choice between them had seemed impossible. Now he realized that the choice had already been made, not by him, but by the three of them together. They had become a family, bound by shared danger and mutual trust. All right, he said finally. We try it Margaret's way. But if this goes wrong, it won't go wrong, Kit said with more confidence than Ezra felt. Margaret's plan is solid, and even if Williams is crooked, he's still a federal marshal. He can't just murder 3 people without consequences. He can if he makes it look like we resisted arrest, Ezra pointed out. Fugitives killed while fleeing federal custody. Happens more often than you'd think. Margaret was already preparing the materials they would need for her plan: paper, ink, and the official seal from Theodore's estate papers. Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance. As night fell over the mountain, the storm began to abate. Through the mine entrance, Ezra could see stars appearing between the racing clouds. By morning, the weather would be clear enough for their pursuers to resume the chase. They'll come at first light, he said, settling down to keep watch. Get some rest while you can. But none of them slept. The abandoned mine felt haunted by the ghosts of Samuel's dreams and the shadows of their own uncertain future. Mining tools that had once represented hope and prosperity now served as weapons in a desperate fight for survival. Kit sat beside Ezra, her shoulder touching his in the narrow space. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Theodore had never arranged those marriages? Every day, Ezra admitted. But wondering doesn't change anything. We are where we are. And where is that exactly? Margaret asked from across the mine chamber. Ezra considered the question seriously. Somewhere I never expected to be. Somewhere better than I deserve. As dawn approached, they made their final preparations. Margaret's plan required precise timing and absolute trust in each other. If even one element went wrong, they would all pay with their lives. But as Ezra watched Kit and Margaret work together with the easy coordination of sisters, he felt a strange sense of peace. Whatever happened in the next few hours, they would face it as they had faced everything else, together. The mining tools that had failed to save Samuel might yet save the 3 people who had become Ezra's new family. Justice would be served one way or another, in the shadow of the mountain where his brother had died and where he had finally learned to live again. Margaret's engagement ring caught the morning sunlight as she twisted it nervously around her finger. The simple gold band that had once symbolized her hopes for a conventional marriage. She had worn it since her arrival in Colorado, a reminder of the life she had expected to build with Theodore Blackwood. Now, as she prepared to use it as bait in their desperate gambit, it would serve a different purpose entirely. Are you sure about this? Kit asked, watching Margaret prepare the forged documents that would either save them or doom them all. I'm sure, Margaret replied, though her hands trembled slightly as she applied Theodore's estate seal to the fake correspondence. Your plan to face them directly was right, but we need leverage. This gives us that leverage. The documents Margaret had created were masterpieces of deception, false orders apparently signed by Judge Ashford, instructing Deputy Marshal Williams to eliminate Kit permanently and make it look like resistance to arrest. The forgeries wouldn't withstand close scrutiny, but they didn't need to. They only needed to seem authentic long enough to force Williams into revealing his true intentions. Ezra was positioned at the mine entrance, his rifle trained on the narrow trail below. "They're coming." 3 men, moving careful-like up the switchbacks. Kit joined him at the entrance, her own weapon ready. Williams in the lead? Hard to tell at this distance, but the man in front matches the description Murphy gave us. Margaret finished her preparations and moved to join them. The plan required her to be the one who confronted Williams initially, using her apparent vulnerability and Eastern refinement to lower his guard. It was the most dangerous role, but Margaret had insisted on taking it. "Remember," she said quietly, "we need Williams to incriminate himself. The moment he admits he's here to kill Kit rather than arrest her, we have him. And if he doesn't cooperate?" Ezra asked. "Then we improvise." The 3 marshals reached the final approach to the mine, their movements betraying both professional caution and growing confidence. They had tracked their quarry to ground, and they clearly believed the chase was nearly over. "Catherine O'Malley!" Williams called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "This is your last chance to surrender peacefully. Come out with your hands visible and no one gets hurt." Margaret stepped into view at the mine entrance, her hands raised but her bearing regal despite the circumstances. "Deputy Marshal Williams, I presume?" "I'm Margaret Sullivan. Perhaps we can discuss this situation like civilized people." Williams was a tall man, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of hard eyes that came from years of violent work. His companions flanked him, their rifles ready but not immediately threatening. "Miss Sullivan, you need to step aside," Williams said with false courtesy. "We're here for Catherine O'Malley on federal charges." "This doesn't concern you?" "I'm afraid it does concern me," Margaret replied, producing the forged documents from her coat. "You see, I've been in correspondence with Judge Ashford in Philadelphia. He's been quite explicit about what he expects you to accomplish here." William's face went pale as Margaret handed him the papers. Ezra watched through his rifle scope as the marshal read the fabricated orders, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm to barely contained rage. "Where did you get these?" Williams demanded. "From Judge Ashford's private correspondence," Margaret lied smoothly. "He wanted to ensure there were no misunderstandings about Miss O'Malley's fate. A material witness who dies resisting arrest can't testify, after all." Williams looked around nervously, clearly calculating whether Margaret's claims were true. The documents were convincing enough to worry him, especially if he was indeed working for Ashford, as they suspected. "You've made a serious mistake, Miss Sullivan," Williams said finally. "These documents are what?" Kit interrupted, stepping into view with her rifle trained on Williams. "Forged, just like your federal marshal credentials?" Williams's hand moved toward his pistol, but froze when Ezra's voice called out from the rocks above. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Marshal. You're covered from 3 different angles." The standoff stretched taut as Williams weighed his options. His 2 companions were looking increasingly uncomfortable, their eyes darting between their leader and the 3 people who had turned the tables on them. "This is a federal investigation," Williams said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're all obstructing justice, are we?" Margaret asked mildly. "Because according to these documents, justice isn't what you're here to serve. You're here to commit murder on behalf of a corrupt judge." One of Williams's companions, a younger man with nervous eyes, spoke up. "Marshal, what's she talking about?" "What documents?" Williams shot him a warning look, but the damage was done. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and Margaret pressed her advantage. "Tell him, Marshal Williams. Tell Deputy Crawford about Judge Ashford's real orders, about how Catherine O'Malley needs to die before she can testify about municipal corruption in Philadelphia." Crawford's face showed growing alarm. "Marshal, is that true? Are we here to kill a witness?" "Shut up, Crawford," Williams snapped. "These people are criminals. Don't let them confuse you with lies and forgeries." But Crawford was already backing away, his rifle lowering. "I signed on to arrest a fugitive, not to murder a witness. If these documents are real, they're not real." Williams shouted, but his desperation was evident. "Can't you see they're trying to manipulate us? Kit stepped closer, her weapon still trained on Williams. Then prove it. Contact your superiors. Verify your orders. If you're legitimate federal marshals investigating real crimes, you should have nothing to hide. Williams's facade finally cracked. With a snarl of rage, he drew his pistol and aimed it at Kit. Enough of this charade. You're coming with me, dead or alive, and anyone who tries to stop me dies with you. But he had revealed his true nature too late. Crawford's rifle swung toward his own superior, while the third marshal stood frozen in confusion. Ezra's shot from above took Williams in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol flying. Margaret moved with surprising speed, scooping up Williams's weapon before he could recover. Kit kept her rifle trained on the wounded marshal, while Crawford helped restrain his corrupt superior. "It's over, Williams," Kit said quietly. "Crawford here is going to take you back to Denver, where you can explain to the real federal authorities why you're carrying forged documents and orders to commit murder." Williams clutched his bleeding shoulder, his face twisted with pain and rage. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. Ashford has people everywhere. This won't end here." "Maybe not," Margaret said, retrieving her engagement ring from where she had dropped it during the confrontation. "But it's a start." Crawford was examining the forged documents with growing understanding. "These are fake, aren't they? You created them to make Williams reveal his real intentions." "We did," Kit admitted. "But his reaction proved what we suspected. He's not here on legitimate federal business." As they secured Williams and prepared for the journey back to civilization, Margaret stood at the edge of the mine entrance and slipped her engagement ring from her finger. The simple gold band represented the conventional life she had once thought she wanted: security, respectability, a place in proper society. But the past months had shown her a different kind of life, one filled with danger and uncertainty, but also with genuine love and friendship. She had found her place not as someone's wife, but as herself, capable, intelligent, and brave enough to face whatever challenges came her way. She turned to find Kit and Ezra watching her, their faces showing the same mixture of relief and exhaustion that she felt. They had survived, had won their freedom through courage and cleverness. But more importantly, they had done it together. "What happens now?" Kit asked. Margaret smiled, pocketing the ring that had once defined her dreams. "Now we go home." But as they began the careful descent from the mountain mine, Margaret realized that home wasn't a place. It was the people she chose to share her life with. The three of them had been forged into a family by adversity, and that bond would endure whatever challenges lay ahead. The corrupt marshal would face justice. The conspiracy that had driven Kit into exile would be exposed. And three people, who had found each other against impossible odds, would finally be free to build the life they chose together. In the distance, the Colorado peaks stretched toward heaven, their snow-covered summits catching the morning light like promises of hope. Whatever the future held, they would face it as they had faced. Everything else united by love and strengthened by shared trials. The mountain had tested them and found them worthy. The new wedding bands gleamed like captured sunlight as the blacksmith in Bear Creek put the finishing touches on the simple gold rings. Unlike the elaborate engagement ring Margaret had once worn, these bands were functional rather than ornamental, sturdy enough to withstand the daily wear of frontier life. Beautiful in their honest simplicity, spring had arrived in the Colorado mountains with its usual dramatic flourish. Melting snow, swelling the creeks, and painting the meadows with wildflowers. 6 months had passed since the confrontation at the mine. 6 months of testimony, trials, and gradual healing. The corruption scandal in Philadelphia had reached all the way to the federal courts, with Judge Ashford and his associates finally facing justice for their crimes. Kit stood at the cabin window, watching Ezra work in the expanded garden they had planted together. The cabin itself had grown over the winter, with 2 additional rooms and a proper kitchen that could accommodate their unconventional household. It was still rustic by Eastern standards, but it was home in a way that no mansion could ever be. Margaret emerged from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands with the satisfied expression of someone who had mastered a difficult skill. Her transformation from helpless Eastern lady to capable frontier woman had been gradual but complete. She could now bake bread that earned praise from Murphy's wife, preserve meat for the winter, and handle a rifle with competence, if not expertise. "The cake is finally finished," Margaret announced. "3 layers like you requested, though I still think it's excessive for a mountain wedding." Kit laughed, the sound bright and joyful in the morning air. "Nothing is excessive for this wedding. We've earned the right to celebrate. The wedding would be small, just Murphy and his wife, a few neighboring settlers, and the itinerant preacher who made his rounds through the high country every few months. But it would be perfect precisely because it was theirs, chosen rather than arranged, born from love rather than legal obligation." Margaret joined Kit at the window, both women watching Ezra tend the vegetables with the same patient care he brought to everything in his life. "Are you nervous?" Margaret asked quietly. "Terrified," Kit admitted, "but in a good way, like standing at the edge of a cliff and knowing you're about to fly." Their relationship had evolved into something none of them could have anticipated when they first met at the trading post. Kit would marry Ezra, as they had all known she would, from the moment they saw them together. But Margaret wasn't being cast aside or forgotten. She had become Kit's sister in all but blood, Ezra's closest friend and confidant, and an integral part of their mountain family. The legal resolution of Kit's situation had cleared the way for this happiness. Deputy Marshal Crawford had proven to be an honest lawman who ensured that Kit's testimony reached the right people in Washington. Judge Ashford's network of corruption had crumbled under federal investigation, and Kit was no longer a fugitive but a protected witness whose courage had helped expose serious crimes. Margaret had played her own crucial role in the legal proceedings, her education and attention to detail helping to organize evidence and testimony. The skills that had seemed useless in the wilderness had proven invaluable in courtrooms and government offices. "I have something for you," Margaret said, reaching into her pocket. She pulled out a small velvet box and handed it to Kit, a wedding gift. Inside the box was Margaret's engagement ring, the one she had worn since arriving in Colorado. But it had been altered, the single stone replaced with 2 smaller gems, one emerald and one sapphire set side by side in the gold band. "Margaret," Kit whispered. "I can't take this." "You're not taking it," Margaret replied. "You're accepting it. The emerald is for your eyes, the sapphire is for mine. It's a symbol of sisterhood, of the bond we've built together." Kit slipped the ring onto her right hand, where it caught the morning light and cast tiny rainbows on the cabin wall. "What will you do now? After the wedding, I mean. You could go back east, find a teaching position, live the life you originally planned." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, watching Ezra work in the garden. "I've been thinking about that. About what I want versus what I thought I was supposed to want. And I think I want to stay here. Not in this cabin. I know you and Ezra need your privacy. But in Colorado, maybe in Denver. There's talk of establishing a real school there, one that would serve the growing population. I could be part of building something new instead of just maintaining something old." Kit felt a surge of relief. She had been dreading the thought of Margaret leaving, of losing the sister she had found in the mountains. "Are you sure? City life would be easier, more comfortable." Margaret smiled, gesturing toward the window where wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion. "Comfort is overrated. I've learned that I prefer challenge." The sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the trail below. Murphy was riding up from the trading post, accompanied by a woman they didn't recognize. As the riders drew closer, Kit could see that the stranger was young, perhaps 20, with the pale complexion and careful dress of someone recently arrived from the east. "Another mail-order bride?" Kit asked with amusement. Margaret laughed. "Probably. Murphy's been getting inquiries from single men throughout the territory. Seems our story has given other women ideas about Western adventures." They went outside to greet the visitors, Ezra joining them from the garden with dirt still on his hands and happiness evident in his weathered face. Murphy dismounted and tipped his hat to the women. "Ladies, I'd like you to meet Miss Emily Watson from St. Louis. She's come west to answer an advertisement from a rancher down in the valley. Thought she might benefit from talking to folks who've made the transition successfully." Emily Watson was clearly nervous, her eyes wide as she took in the rustic cabin and the three people who lived there in unconventional harmony. Kit remembered her own first glimpse of mountain life and felt a surge of sympathy for the young woman. "Would you like some coffee?" Margaret offered, "and perhaps some advice about frontier life." As they gathered around the cabin's expanded table, Kit found herself thinking about the strange paths that had brought them all together. Emily's story was different from theirs. She was fleeing poverty rather than corruption, seeking opportunity rather than safety, but the underlying courage was the same. "The hardest part," Kit told the young woman, "is letting go of who you think you're supposed to be and discovering who you really are." Emily nodded eagerly. "My mother thinks I'm crazy for coming west. She says no good can come of it." Margaret poured coffee with the easy hospitality that had become second nature. "Mothers often see only the dangers in change. They sometimes miss the possibilities." As the afternoon wore on, they shared stories and advice, helping Emily prepare for the challenges ahead. When Murphy and his charge finally departed, Kit felt the satisfaction that came from helping someone else navigate the treacherous waters of transformation. The wedding took place the next morning, with the preacher conducting the ceremony on the cabin's front porch, while the mountains provided a cathedral backdrop. Kit wore a simple white dress that Margaret had sewn from fabric ordered specially from Denver. Ezra had trimmed his beard and wore his best shirt, looking both nervous and radiant. The vows they exchanged were traditional in form, but revolutionary in content, promising partnership rather than subservience, mutual support rather than possession. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, their kiss sealed not just a marriage, but the completion of a journey that had transformed them all. As the small gathering celebrated with Margaret's cake and Murphy's fiddle music, Kit reflected on the impossible chain of events that had brought her to this moment. Theodore Blackwood's scheme had been designed to provide his nephew with a suitable wife, but it had accomplished something far more precious. It had created a family bound by choice, tested by adversity, and strengthened by love. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the western peaks when Margaret made her announcement. She would be leaving for Denver in 2 weeks to begin her new position at the territorial school. It was the right decision, they all knew, but it still brought tears to Kit's eyes. "You'll visit," Margaret said firmly. "Both of you. Denver isn't so far that we can't see each other regularly. And you'll visit us," Kit replied. "This will always be your home too." As evening approached and the guests departed, Kit and Ezra stood together on their porch, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. The silence that had once been Ezra's only companion was now filled with the sounds of shared life. Margaret's quiet humming from the kitchen, the crackle of the fire, the distant call of a night bird. "Any regrets?" Ezra asked, his arm warm around Kit's shoulders. Kit thought of Thomas Hartwell, of the corruption she had fled, of the comfortable but constrained life she had left behind in Philadelphia. "Only that it took us so long to find each other." Ezra squeezed her closer. "We found each other when we needed to. That's what matters." Inside the cabin, Margaret was preparing for her last few weeks as part of their daily household. Soon she would begin her own new adventure, building a life that honored both her education and her hard-won independence. But tonight they were still together, still the unlikely family that had been forged in the crucible of necessity and tempered by the fires of mutual respect. The mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of snow from the high peaks and the promise of seasons yet to come. There would be challenges ahead. Harsh winters, difficult harvests, the everyday struggles of frontier life. But they would face those challenges as they had faced everything else, with courage, intelligence, and the unshakable knowledge that they had chosen each other freely and completely. Some men, Kit reflected, were indeed shaped by loneliness, but others were shaped by love, by the willingness to risk everything for the chance to build something true and lasting. Ezra Blackwood had learned the difference, and in learning it, he had saved not just himself, but two women who had traveled across a continent seeking nothing more than a chance at happiness. The wedding bands on their fingers caught the starlight, simple circles of gold that represented promises as enduring as the mountains themselves. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to prove that love chosen freely was stronger than any legal contract or social expectation. But tonight, as the Colorado wilderness settled into peaceful slumber around them, three people who had found each other against impossible odds stood together on the threshold of a future they had earned through courage, sacrifice, and an unwavering faith in the power of human connection. The silence of the mountains was no longer empty. It was full of possibility, rich with the promise of years to come, and sweet with the knowledge that some stories, against all odds, really do have happy endings. In the distance, a wolf howled its ancient song to the star-filled sky, and the sound carried no loneliness at all, only the wild, free music of a life lived completely honestly. And without apology, the mountain man, who had inherited two mail-order brides, had discovered something far more valuable than silver in his high country refuge. He had found love, family, and the kind of happiness that could only be built one careful day at a time, one shared challenge at a time, one honest choice at a time, and in finding it, he had given two brave women the greatest gift of all, the freedom to become exactly who they were meant to be.